On the chilly afternoon of March 15, 2017, the quiet suburb of Westfield lay bathed in a pale, waning sunlight. Shadows stretched long across the perfectly trimmed lawns and pristine sidewalks, where silence was only broken by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a passing car. But for Linda Abbott, the neighborhood's ever-watchful resident, something felt eerily out of place. Her closest neighbor, Emily Harper, was known for her meticulous routine. Every morning, like clockwork, Emily would draw open her curtains, flooding her stately home with natural light. Yet, on this particular day, the windows of the Harper residence remained darkened. The house appeared still, too still. Linda couldn't recall seeing Emily all day, not even tending to her garden or waving from the porch as she usually did. At first, Linda dismissed her unease as mere paranoia. But as the hours ticked by, her worry deepened. By 4 p.m., after leaving multiple unanswered voicemails and nervously pacing her living room, Linda decided to check on Emily in person. Something wasn't right. Approaching the Harper home, Linda's stomach churned with an inexplicable sense of dread. She rang the doorbell, the chime echoing faintly inside. No response. She knocked louder, calling Emily's name, her voice trembling slightly. Still nothing. The house remained unnervingly quiet, its stately white facade now seeming cold and uninviting. Linda's pulse quickened as she made her way around to the side of the house. She remembered how Emily often left her living room curtains slightly parted. Peering through the narrow gap, Linda's heart began to pound. Her eyes scanned the familiar room but quickly froze on a scene that would haunt her forever. The once pristine living room was in utter disarray. Furniture lay overturned, decorative cushions were flung haphazardly across the floor. Dark, ominous smears marred the pale walls, and on the polished hardwood floor lay Emily's lifeless body. Her figure was twisted unnaturally, a pool of blood spreading beneath her head like a crimson halo. Linda staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth as a choked scream escaped her lips. Panic gripped her as she fumbled for her phone, her trembling fingers barely able to press the emergency number. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice provided little comfort as Linda stammered, It's my neighbor, she's dead. There's blood everywhere. Ma'am, stay calm, the operator replied. Do not enter the house. Help is on the way. Minutes felt like hours as Linda waited, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the muffled noises of the world around her. Finally, the wail of sirens pierced the suburban stillness. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the Harper home as police cruisers and an ambulance pulled to the curb. Officers quickly cordoned off the area, transforming the once idyllic street into a scene of chaos. Linda stood frozen on the sidewalk, her hands still trembling as she watched the flurry of activity. Uniformed officers entered the house with grim determination, while neighbors began gathering in clusters, whispering in hushed tones. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the street into an uneasy twilight, Linda realized with chilling certainty, this quiet neighborhood would never feel safe again. To the outside world, the Harpers seemed like the perfect suburban family. Their stately White House with its manicured lawn and symmetrical flower beds stood as a testament to their success. Inside, framed photographs lined the walls, capturing moments of joy, Emily Harper smiling brightly at her wedding, her husband Mark holding her hand, and the couple toasting at a holiday party. Yet, behind those carefully curated images and spotless windows, their life was far from idyllic. Emily Harper, 32, had once been the embodiment of grace and poise. As a full-time homemaker, her days revolved around keeping her house immaculate, cooking lavish meals, and hosting dinner parties that drew admiration from her neighbors. But beneath her polished exterior, Emily wrestled with a growing void in her life. Mark, her husband of 10 years, was a 40-year-old financial advisor whose relentless work schedule kept him away from home more often than not. His long hours and frequent business trips had left Emily feeling isolated and unfulfilled. At first, Emily tried to dismiss her loneliness as temporary. She filled her days with gardening, volunteering, and endless to-do lists, but the ache in her chest never quite went away. Over time, the spark in her marriage had dimmed, replaced by polite but distant conversations over dinner when Mark was home. He was always kind, but his mind often seemed elsewhere, lost in client meetings or investment portfolios. Emily felt invisible, her once vivid world fading into monotony. It was during one of Mark's extended absences in the fall of 2016 that Emily met Henry Cooper. The 69-year-old retired engineer lived next door, tending quietly to his garden and keeping mostly to himself. Henry had moved to Westfield nearly 2 decades earlier with his wife, Margaret, but she had passed away from cancer 5 years ago. Since then, Henry's life had been a solitary routine, marked by early morning walks, crossword puzzles, and the occasional wave to neighbors. One crisp October afternoon, as Emily struggled to carry a heavy bag of soil from her car, Henry happened to be passing by. He offered to help, and Emily, grateful for the assistance, invited him in for tea as a thank you. What began as a polite gesture soon blossomed into something unexpected. Their conversations flowed easily, with Henry sharing stories about his years as an engineer and Emily confiding in him about her loneliness. Henry became a regular visitor to the Harper home. At first, their meetings were casual, tea on the porch, brief chats about the weather, or gardening tips. But as the weeks passed, their connection deepened. Emily found in Henry a kindred spirit, someone who listened to her with genuine interest, unlike the distracted attention she often received from Mark. Henry, in turn, found solace in Emily's company, a warmth he hadn't felt since his wife's death. By winter, their bond had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Emily felt alive in Henry's presence, rediscovering emotions she hadn't experienced in years. With Mark away on yet another business trip, the boundaries between friendship and something more began to blur. On a rainy December afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, the tension between them reached its breaking point. Emily leaned in and kissed Henry, a kiss that was both hesitant and electrifying, a release of months of unspoken longing. What followed was a secret affair that became both a refuge and a risk. Henry and Emily met frequently, their time together punctuated by stolen glances and whispered conversations. For Emily, the affair was a lifeline, an escape from the emptiness of her marriage. For Henry, it was a chance to feel alive again, to reclaim a piece of the love he thought he'd lost forever. But secrets have a way of unraveling. By late December, Mark began to notice subtle changes in Emily's behavior, her distracted demeanor, the way she lingered on her phone, and the faint trace of a different cologne in the house. One evening, while checking emails on their shared laptop, Mark stumbled across a message from Henry. Its contents left no room for doubt: Emily was having an affair with their elderly neighbor. Mark confronted Emily that night, his voice sharp with anger and disbelief. Emily, cornered, confessed everything but begged for forgiveness. She promised to end the affair immediately, swearing that she still loved Mark and wanted to repair their marriage. Though furious and humiliated, Mark agreed to stay, but the atmosphere in their home turned cold. Emily kept her word. She distanced herself from Henry, ignoring his calls and avoiding their usual meeting places. But Henry, devastated by her sudden withdrawal, grew desperate. In February 2017, he began sending her increasingly emotional emails, pleading for just one more chance to see her. Emily never replied. She was determined to rebuild her life with Mark, but the cracks in her marriage were deeper than she realized, and the past would not stay buried for long. By early March 2017, Emily Harper's resolve to mend her marriage was unwavering, but the weight of her choices hung over her like a storm cloud. She spent her days walking on eggshells around Mark, who had grown colder since the confrontation about her affair. Conversations between them were terse, and the warmth that once existed in their home felt like a distant memory. Emily had hoped that cutting ties with Henry Cooper would bring her closer to Mark, but instead, it left her feeling more isolated than ever. For Henry, the sudden end to their relationship was a crushing blow. He had invested his heart into Emily, believing she was the second chance at love he thought he would never have. In his mind, their connection wasn't just an affair, it was salvation. When Emily abruptly ended things, Henry spiraled into despair. His once quiet life now felt unbearably empty, the silence in his home a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. Henry's attempts to reach Emily through emails and phone calls went unanswered. Each rejection amplified his feelings of abandonment and betrayal, pushing him closer to the edge. On the evening of March 14, Henry sat in his dimly lit living room, clutching an old photograph of himself and his late wife. The pain of losing her, combined with the recent collapse of his relationship with Emily, left him teetering on the brink of emotional collapse. His mind raced with thoughts he could barely contain. How could she just walk away? After everything we shared, doesn't she care at all? The next day, Henry made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't let Emily slip away without one final attempt to salvage what they had. Desperation outweighed reason as he walked to the Harper house that afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty save for a few parked cars. Henry hesitated at the front door, his heart pounding as he raised his hand to knock. Emily answered, her expression a mixture of surprise and apprehension. She hadn't expected to see Henry, and his disheveled appearance immediately put her on edge. "Henry, you shouldn't be here," she said firmly, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if Mark might suddenly appear. "Emily, please," Henry began, his voice trembling. "I just need to talk. 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Emily stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. She crossed her arms, a defensive gesture as much to shield herself as to create distance. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her tone resolute. "I told you, it's over. I'm trying to fix things with Mark." Henry's face twisted with anguish. "Fix things with Mark? After everything he's put you through? After everything we've shared?" His voice cracked, desperation bleeding into anger. "You don't just get to walk away like this." Emily's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, Henry, but this was a mistake. I can't keep living a lie. Please, go home." As Emily turned to re-enter the house, Henry's desperation boiled over into rage. Without thinking, he followed her inside, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. "You don't get to dismiss me like this," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Henry, stop!" Emily cried, backing away as fear took hold. The situation escalated in seconds, spiraling out of control. Henry's eyes darted around the room, landing on the fireplace mantel where a polished gold trophy stood. His hand reached for it without conscious thought, the weight of it grounding him in his turmoil. "Don't do this," Emily pleaded, her voice shaking. "You need to leave." But Henry couldn't hear her over the cacophony of his own despair. In one terrible, irreversible moment, he swung the trophy with all the force of his anguish, striking Emily on the side of her head. She staggered backward, crashing into the coffee table before collapsing to the floor. The room fell silent except for Henry's ragged breathing. Reality hit him like a tidal wave as he stared at Emily's motionless body. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark and viscous against the polished wood floor. The trophy slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly as it hit the ground. "Oh God," he whispered, backing away. "What have I done?" Panic consumed him. He stumbled out of the house, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts. "No one can know. It was an accident. I just need to go home." Without looking back, Henry fled, leaving behind the chaos and devastation he had unleashed. As the sun set over Westfield that evening, the Harper home stood eerily silent, its immaculate exterior betraying no hint of the tragedy within. The streets remained empty, the neighborhood blissfully unaware that its facade of perfection had just been shattered in the most horrifying way imaginable. The morning of March 16, 2017, dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that seemed to absorb every sound and cast a somber pall over the town of Westfield. Detective Rachel Carter arrived at the Harper residence shortly after 9 a.m. She stepped out of her unmarked sedan, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. The once idyllic home was now cordoned off with police tape, and the quiet buzz of forensic activity filled the air. Rachel had seen her share of grisly crime scenes in her 15 years on the force, but something about this case felt different. Maybe it was the eerie stillness of the neighborhood, or the pristine white exterior of the house that seemed to mock the horrors inside. She drew a deep breath, steeling herself as she stepped through the front door. The living room was a portrait of chaos. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and dark red stains smeared across the pale walls painted a vivid picture of the violence that had unfolded. Emily Harper's body had been removed overnight, but the outlines of where she had fallen remained starkly visible, etched into Rachel's mind as she studied the scene. The forensic team was already at work, dusting for fingerprints, photographing every detail, and carefully cataloging evidence. A blood-spattered trophy lay near the fireplace, its weight and ornate design marking it as both decorative and deadly. Rachel knelt down beside it, examining the blunt edges. "The murder weapon?" she asked. One of the forensic technicians, a young man with a furrowed brow, nodded. "Based on the pattern of the injuries, it's a match. We've also found fingerprints on it, we're running them now." Rachel's mind raced as she pieced together the initial clues. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer had been someone Emily knew and trusted. The signs of a struggle indicated that Emily had fought back, her defensive wounds a grim testament to her final moments. As Rachel moved through the rest of the house, she noted the stark contrast between the chaos of the living room and the pristine order of the upstairs bedrooms. The kitchen was spotless, the dining room untouched. The violence had been contained to one room, a deliberate act fueled by anger and emotion. Later that morning, as Rachel interviewed the Harpers' neighbors, the pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Linda Abbott, who had discovered the scene, described Emily as friendly but increasingly withdrawn in recent months. Another neighbor mentioned seeing an elderly man, Henry Cooper, frequently visiting the Harper home while Mark was away on business. "Henry Cooper," Rachel murmured, writing the name in her notebook. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. By early afternoon, the fingerprint results came back, a match to Henry. Rachel wasted no time. She and her team arrived at Henry's modest home to find him sitting in his living room, staring blankly at the television. His demeanor was calm, almost resigned, but Rachel could see the weight of guilt etched into his face. "Mr. Cooper, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but measured. At the station, Rachel confronted Henry with the evidence, his fingerprints on the trophy, the blood on his shirt, and witness statements placing him at the Harper home on the day of the murder. At first, Henry tried to explain away the evidence, claiming the blood was from an earlier accident when Emily had cut herself in the kitchen. But his story fell apart under Rachel's relentless questioning. "Henry, we know you were there," Rachel said, sliding a photograph of the crime scene across the table. "The evidence doesn't lie. It's time you tell us the truth." Henry's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph, tears welling in his eyes. Finally, with a shuddering breath, he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight of his despair. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I loved her." As Henry recounted the events of that fateful afternoon, Rachel listened intently, piecing together his confession. The anger, the desperation, the moment of blind rage, it all painted a chilling picture of a man driven to violence by emotions he could no longer control. When the confession ended, Rachel leaned back in her chair, the room heavy with silence. There was no satisfaction in solving this case, only a deep, lingering sadness. A woman was dead, a man's life was ruined, and a community's sense of security was shattered. But Rachel's instincts told her there was more to this story. As she reviewed the evidence later that night, a nagging thought crept into her mind. The timing, the motive, something still didn't add up. And then there was Mark Harper, Emily's husband. His alibi seemed airtight, but Rachel had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. For now, Henry Cooper was in custody, and the case seemed closed. Yet Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the truth might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered. The trial of Henry Cooper began on May 1, 2017, drawing crowds from across Westfield and beyond. The once quiet town now buzzed with tension, the courtroom packed with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to hear how an elderly man, known for his gentle demeanor, had become the center of such a violent, shocking crime. Henry sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly, his face pale but composed. He had already confessed to striking Emily Harper in a moment of rage, but the trial was about more than just his guilt, it was about understanding why. The prosecution sought to paint Henry as a man consumed by obsession, while the defense argued he had acted out of desperation and emotional instability. The prosecution opened with a damning narrative. They described Henry as an older man infatuated with a younger, vulnerable woman, unable to accept her rejection. They emphasized the deliberate nature of his actions, the fingerprints on the murder weapon, the defensive wounds on Emily's arms, and the blood-stained shirt Henry had worn that day. This was not an accident, the prosecutor declared. This was an act of uncontrolled rage by a man who couldn't let go. Witnesses were called to support the prosecution's case. Linda Abbott testified about Henry's frequent visits to the Harper home and Emily's sudden withdrawal from social interactions in the months leading up to her death. A forensic expert detailed the injuries Emily had sustained, describing the sheer force required to deliver the fatal blow. But the defense was determined to shift the narrative. They argued that Henry was not a cold-blooded killer but a lonely, grieving man who had acted impulsively in a moment of heartbreak. Henry Cooper is not a monster, his attorney began. He's a man who lost control in a situation fueled by deep emotional pain. The defense presented Henry's confession as evidence of his remorse. They highlighted his clean record, his years of quiet service to the community, and his isolation following his wife's death. They painted a picture of a man who had been drawn into a relationship he never sought but couldn't resist, a man who had loved Emily and was destroyed by the thought of losing her. To complicate matters further, the defense introduced an alternative theory, that Mark Harper, Emily's husband, had more motive and opportunity than anyone else. They revealed that Mark had discovered the affair months earlier, a revelation that had deeply fractured the Harper marriage. The defense suggested that Mark, humiliated and enraged, could have returned home unexpectedly on the day of the murder. They questioned why Mark had seemingly avoided contact with Emily during his business trips in the weeks leading up to her death, a departure from his usual behavior. Consider this, the defense attorney urged the jury. Mark Harper had everything to lose, his marriage, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. Could a man in his position truly have accepted betrayal without seeking retribution? Mark was called to testify, and his presence electrified the courtroom. Calm and composed, he denied any involvement in his wife's death. He described his grief over Emily's loss and his disbelief upon learning about her affair with Henry. Yet, under cross-examination, cracks began to show. Mark admitted to a heated argument with Emily months before her death, during which he had threatened to leave her if she didn't end the affair. "I was angry," Mark said, his voice tight. "But I would never hurt her." Despite the defense's efforts, the prosecution remained focused on the physical evidence against Henry. The fingerprints, the blood-stained shirt, and Henry's own confession painted a picture too clear to ignore. "This case is not about Mark Harper," the prosecutor argued in closing. "It's about Henry Cooper, a man who acted out of selfishness and anger, taking the life of an innocent woman." The jury deliberated for 2 tense days. The community buzzed with speculation, neighbors gathering in coffee shops and on front porches to debate the case. Some believed Henry's guilt was undeniable, while others questioned whether Mark's role in the tragedy had been fully explored. On May 3, 2017, the verdict was read. The jury found Henry Cooper guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Henry lowered his head, tears streaming down his face. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As Henry was led away in handcuffs, the once gentle man now a convicted killer, the courtroom remained heavy with unanswered questions. Mark Harper left quietly, his expression unreadable, his future uncertain. Detective Rachel Carter, seated in the back of the courtroom, couldn't shake the feeling that the case wasn't fully resolved. Despite the mountain of evidence against Henry, something about Mark's testimony gnawed at her. The timeline, his behavior, it didn't sit right. As the crowd dispersed and the cameras turned away, Rachel resolved to keep digging. In her experience, the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. For now, the trial was over, and Westfield would attempt to return to normal. But for those closest to the case, the scars would remain, a chilling reminder of how quickly love, betrayal, and desperation could unravel even the most perfect lives. Though the trial of Henry Cooper had concluded, the ripple effects of Emily Harper's murder continued to haunt the once idyllic suburb of Westfield. The community, still reeling from the revelation of Henry's double life and the violent act he had confessed to, struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet retiree with that of a murderer. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what truly drove Henry to such extremes, while others remained convinced the case had deeper, darker undercurrents. For Detective Rachel Carter, the sense of finality that should have come with Henry's conviction was elusive. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, the blood on his shirt, and his own confession, Rachel couldn't ignore the details that didn't quite add up. Mark Harper, with his calculated demeanor and airtight alibi, remained an enigma. Late one evening, Rachel sat at her desk in the precinct, poring over the case files once more. The photos of the crime scene, the timeline of events, and witness statements were scattered across the table. The forensic evidence clearly placed Henry at the scene, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something critical had been overlooked. Her instincts, honed over 15 years of chasing truths buried beneath lies, told her there was more to this story. Then came the email. It arrived in Rachel's inbox marked as anonymous, the subject line stark and direct, "You've missed something." The message contained only a single sentence, "Ask Mark Harper where he really was at 2 p.m. on March 15th. Attached was a grainy photo, seemingly taken from a distance. It showed a man who appeared to be Mark, standing near a highway rest stop, his face partially obscured but his distinctive build and tailored coat unmistakable. The timestamp read 2:05 p.m., placing him just an hour before Emily's estimated time of death and nowhere near the business meeting he claimed to have attended. Rachel's pulse quickened as she leaned back in her chair. The photo didn't prove anything concrete, but it was enough to reopen the door to Mark's potential involvement. She forwarded the email to her team, marking it for immediate review, and requested additional surveillance footage from the area. The next morning, Rachel visited Mark Harper's office under the guise of a routine follow-up. As she sat across from him in his sleek, minimalist office, she studied his every movement. Mark remained as composed as ever, answering her questions with a measured tone that betrayed no emotion. But when Rachel casually mentioned the rest stop, a flicker of something passed over his face, too fleeting to confirm but enough to raise her suspicions. "Detective, I've already told you everything I know," Mark said smoothly, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. "I was at a meeting in Newark that afternoon. I've provided the records." Rachel nodded but didn't press further. She knew better than to reveal her hand too early. Later that day, Rachel's team retrieved additional surveillance footage from the rest stop, and what they found deepened the mystery. The footage showed Mark exiting his car and making a phone call. Moments later, a black SUV pulled up beside him, and he handed over what appeared to be a manila envelope before driving away. The interaction lasted less than a minute, but its implications were significant. Who had Mark met with, and what had he given them? Rachel's determination intensified. She began quietly re-examining Mark's financial records, travel logs, and personal connections, looking for anything that might tie him to the murder. Each lead seemed to raise more questions than answers, but Rachel was undeterred. Meanwhile, life in Westfield moved on, or tried to. The Harpers' once pristine home sat vacant, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Henry Cooper, now serving his sentence, rarely spoke to anyone in prison. Those who interacted with him described him as a broken man, resigned to his fate but insistent that his actions were born out of love, not malice. By early June, Rachel had uncovered enough inconsistencies in Mark's story to warrant a formal interview. This time, he was less cooperative. His calm facade began to crack under the weight of Rachel's pointed questions, and his responses grew defensive. When she presented the surveillance footage, Mark's composure shattered. "I had nothing to do with Emily's death," he snapped, his voice rising for the first time. "Yes, I went to that rest stop, but it has nothing to do with this case. You're chasing shadows." Rachel leaned in, her gaze steady. "Then tell me why you were there. Who did you meet with, and why did you lie about your whereabouts?" Mark fell silent, his jaw tightening. For the first time, Rachel saw fear in his eyes. The investigation into Mark Harper's potential involvement was just beginning, but one thing was clear: the shadows surrounding Emily Harper's death were far from dispelled. For Detective Rachel Carter, the truth remained elusive, slipping through her fingers like smoke. But she was determined to uncover it, no matter how long it took or how deep she had to dig. Because in Westfield, the facade of perfection had already cracked, and Rachel was ready to break it wide open. By mid-June 2017, Detective Rachel Carter's suspicions about Mark Harper had solidified into a relentless pursuit for the truth. The anonymous email and the surveillance footage from the rest stop had cracked open the seemingly airtight case against Henry Cooper, leaving Rachel convinced there was more to the story. As she pieced together the fragments of Mark's carefully constructed alibi, a darker narrative began to emerge, one that pointed to a man consumed by anger, jealousy, and a desperate need to protect his reputation. Rachel's investigation gained momentum when financial records revealed a series of unusual transactions from Mark's personal account. In the weeks leading up to Emily's murder, Mark had withdrawn several large sums of cash, amounts that didn't align with his usual spending habits. Further digging uncovered that one of these withdrawals coincided with the day he was seen at the rest stop. The link was tenuous but suggestive: was Mark paying someone off? Rachel wasn't alone in her suspicions. Her team, initially skeptical, began to rally behind her as new evidence surfaced. A subpoena for Mark's phone records revealed several calls to a burner phone on the day of Emily's death. The number, untraceable to any individual, was active for only a short period and then disconnected entirely, another red flag in a growing pile of inconsistencies. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker at the rest stop recognized Mark's photograph from the surveillance footage. He seemed on edge, the worker recalled during an interview. Kept looking around like he was waiting for someone. Didn't stay long, just handed something over and left. Rachel's instincts told her that someone Mark met was the key to unlocking the truth. But without knowing who they were or what was exchanged, she was left chasing shadows. Meanwhile, Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic. The polished, unflappable facade he had maintained since Emily's death began to show cracks. Colleagues at his firm noted his frequent absences and distracted demeanor. Rumors swirled about his involvement in Emily's affair and the growing scrutiny of his alibi. The weight of the investigation seemed to be pressing down on him, and Rachel intended to capitalize on it. In late June, armed with a warrant, Rachel's team searched Mark's home. They combed through every drawer, closet, and hidden corner, eventually discovering a locked safe in the basement. Inside were documents, photographs, and a small notebook filled with cryptic notes and dates. Among the papers was a receipt for a burner phone purchased a month before Emily's murder, further tying Mark to the mysterious calls. The most damning discovery, however, was a handwritten note in Emily's handwriting. It was undated but clearly written during the final weeks of her life. "Mark, I'm sorry for what I've done, but I can't keep living like this. We need to talk about what comes next." The tone was apologetic yet firm, suggesting Emily had confronted Mark about their fractured relationship, and possibly more. Rachel now had enough to bring Mark in for formal questioning. This time, the interview took a different tone. Rachel laid out the evidence: the burner phone, the cash withdrawals, the surveillance footage, and the note. Mark's confident demeanor faltered under the weight of the mounting accusations. "You think I killed my wife," he said, his voice a mix of incredulity and anger. "Do you know how ridiculous that sounds?" "Ridiculous?" Rachel countered, her tone icy. "What sounds ridiculous is how you've lied about your whereabouts, tampered with evidence, and gone to great lengths to conceal your actions. If you're innocent, Mark, you're doing a terrible job of proving it." Mark's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill Emily," he said firmly. "But I won't say any more without a lawyer." His refusal to cooperate only deepened Rachel's resolve. She instructed her team to dig deeper into Mark's connections, particularly anyone who might have been involved in the mysterious rest stop meeting. It wasn't long before they found a lead, a man named Ryan Tate, a former private investigator with a history of questionable ethics. Bank records showed a transfer from Mark's account to Tate's just days after Emily's death. Rachel tracked down Tate, who had since relocated to a neighboring state. Confronted with evidence of his involvement, Tate initially stonewalled, but Rachel's relentless questioning eventually broke through his defenses. "Mark hired me to track Emily," Tate admitted, his voice barely audible. "He suspected the affair and wanted proof. But when he found out the truth, he told me to scare the guy off. Said he'd handle the rest." Rachel pressed him further. "What do you mean by, handle the rest? Did Mark ask you to do anything else?" Tate hesitated, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. "No, nothing like that. He was furious. Said she was ruining his life." Though Tate denied direct involvement in the murder, his testimony painted a chilling picture of Mark's state of mind in the weeks leading up to Emily's death. It was enough for Rachel to obtain a warrant for Mark's arrest. On July 3, 2017, Mark Harper was taken into custody, charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. While the case against him was still circumstantial, the combined weight of the evidence pointed to his deep entanglement in Emily's death. As the town of Westfield braced itself for yet another trial, the cracks in its facade of perfection grew wider. For Rachel, the search for the full truth continued. With Mark behind bars and Henry Cooper already serving his sentence, she was left grappling with a haunting question: in a tragedy defined by betrayal, rage, and desperation, could justice ever truly be served? As the summer of 2017 drew to a close, Westfield remained a community divided. The dual arrests of Henry Cooper and Mark Harper had left lingering questions about what truly happened on the day of Emily Harper's death. In the weeks following Mark's indictment, the media frenzy escalated, and whispers of conspiracy filled the town's quiet streets. But for Detective Rachel Carter, the case was far from over. Rachel spent her days poring over every detail, determined to untangle the web of deceit that had engulfed the Harper murder. While Henry's confession had initially seemed irrefutable, the mounting evidence against Mark suggested a more complicated truth. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that both men were involved, but in ways that neither had fully admitted. The breakthrough came in the form of an overlooked piece of evidence, a voicemail retrieved from Emily's phone. Dated March 14, 2017, just one day before her murder, the message was from Mark. His tone was cold, clipped, and filled with quiet menace. "We need to talk," he had said. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine. You need to make a choice, Emily." The message, combined with Mark's clandestine meeting at the rest stop, painted a damning picture of a man on the edge. Rachel began piecing together a theory. Mark, fueled by jealousy and a need to control, had discovered Emily's affair long before their confrontation in December. He had hired Ryan Tate to gather evidence, confronted Henry privately, and orchestrated a plan to end the affair permanently. Rachel's investigation uncovered that Mark had threatened Henry weeks before the murder, warning him to stay away from Emily. Emails retrieved from Henry's computer revealed messages of increasing panic and desperation, with Henry pleading for Emily to intervene. "He said he'd ruin me," one email read. "Emily, I can't keep living like this. Please talk to him." On the morning of July 20, 2017, Rachel visited Henry in prison. She needed answers, clarity about his state of mind and Mark's potential involvement. Sitting across from her in the stark visiting room, Henry appeared frail, his once defensive posture now slumped with the weight of regret. "Henry," Rachel began, her voice firm but gentle, "I need to know the truth. Did Mark Harper threaten you before Emily's death?" Henry hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them on the table. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "He came to my house. Said if I didn't end things with Emily, he'd destroy me. My reputation, my finances, everything. I told Emily, but she thought she could handle it." Rachel leaned in. "What happened the day she died? Tell me everything." Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he recounted the events. He admitted to going to the Harper house, desperate to see Emily one last time, but insisted the confrontation had escalated only after she revealed Mark had discovered their affair. "She was terrified," Henry said, his voice cracking. "She said Mark knew everything and that he'd do anything to protect himself." As Henry described the argument and the moment of violence, Rachel realized the full complexity of the case. Mark had orchestrated a psychological war, pushing Henry to the breaking point while maintaining his own image of innocence. It wasn't a simple case of love and betrayal, it was a calculated manipulation designed to leave no trace. With Henry's new testimony, Rachel confronted Mark one final time. Presented with the full weight of evidence, Mark's carefully maintained facade crumbled. He admitted to threatening both Emily and Henry, though he vehemently denied involvement in Emily's actual death. "I didn't kill her," he said, his voice shaking. "But she betrayed me. She destroyed everything." By the end of July, the case against Mark grew strong enough to charge him with criminal coercion and conspiracy to commit assault. While Henry remained convicted of second-degree murder, Mark's manipulation and threats were revealed as the catalysts for Emily's tragic death. The dual convictions left Westfield in shock. The Harper house was sold, its pristine exterior unable to mask the darkness that had unfolded within. Henry Cooper, once a beloved neighbor, was now a cautionary tale of how love and desperation could spiral into tragedy. Mark Harper, the man who seemed to have it all, was exposed as a manipulative figure whose actions led to the destruction of everything he claimed to value. For Rachel, the case's conclusion was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars left behind were permanent. She stood outside the courthouse on the day of Mark's sentencing, watching as reporters swarmed around him. Despite the chaos, she felt a quiet sense of resolve. She had done her job, but the cost had been high, for everyone involved. In the end, Emily Harper's death was not the result of one person's actions but a chain reaction of betrayal, control, and unchecked emotion. It was a reminder of how fragile the veneer of perfection could be and how quickly it could shatter when faced with the truth. As Rachel drove away from the courthouse, the quiet streets of Westfield stretched out before her, their manicured lawns and picturesque homes untouched by the turmoil that had consumed the Harpers' lives. But for Rachel, and for those who knew the full story, the shadows would always remain.